Silas Croft swung his axe again, the thin, high-altitude air of the Colorado Rockies pressing around him, unaware that the rhythm of his own failure was about to change how men survived in the high country. It was the winter of 1844, a cold so deep it seemed to have a sound, a high, crystalline ringing. He was working on a stand of frozen oak, trees so hard they felt more like iron than timber. His axe, a standard-issue trade bit he'd gotten at Bent's Fort, was his life. It built his shelter, it cut his fuel, it protected him, and it was failing. With every swing, he felt a painful, inefficient shock travel up the hickory handle and into his forearms. Thud. The blade bit barely a quarter-inch, and the sound was wrong. It wasn't the clean, explosive thwack of a good cut. It was a dull, complaining clank. He worked for an hour to fell a tree that should have taken 20 minutes, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his body soaked in sweat that instantly chilled. He paused, leaning on the handle, and pulled his mitten off to inspect the blade. The low, weak sun glinted off the edge. It was ruined. 2 large, crescent-shaped chips were missing from the bit, and the rest of the edge was rolled over, blunt as a froe. He cursed, a quiet, bitter sound lost in the wind. This was the 3rd time since the first hard frost. He could sharpen it, of course, spend hours with his file and stone, trying to work the nicks out, but he knew what would happen. The steel was too brittle in the cold. If he hit the wood at the slightest wrong angle, it shattered. It was a betrayal. This tool, his primary partner in survival, was becoming his enemy. He thought of the summer, and the memory brought no comfort. In the summer, the same axe presented the opposite problem. Felling the wet, sappy aspen and pine, the edge he'd painstakingly sharpened would bite deep, but then it would stick. The blade profile was too thick, the cheeks too wide, and it would bind in the green wood, forcing him to wrestle it free after every cut, wasting precious energy. If he thinned the edge to make it slice better, it was too weak, rolling over on the first knot. It was a constant, exhausting compromise. He looked from his failing tool to the looming, indifferent mountains. He was wasting his strength, fighting his own axe instead of the wilderness. Everyone said an axe was an axe. You bought one, you sharpened it, you used it. But Silas Croft, cold, frustrated, and staring at a chipped piece of steel, realized that what everyone said was wrong. This tool, designed for everything, was mastering nothing. It was a jack of all trades in a land that demanded a master. That winter, he would be colder than he needed to be, and he would burn with the realization that the fault was not in his arm, but in the fundamental design of the tool in his hand. That winter nearly broke him. He spent more time maintaining his tool than using it. His tiny, drafty cabin, built the standard way, just like his axe was sharpened. The standard way was a monument to flawed compromise. He had followed the advice of the other settlers in the valley below. Build it fast, build it simple. 4 walls of green pine, chinked with mud and grass, with a fireplace that smoked him out more than it warmed him. He sat inside, his back to the wall, listening to the wind find every single crack. He had to burn twice the wood he'd planned just to keep the damp chill at bay. And getting that wood was the problem. He'd spent half a day filing the chips out of his axe blade, only to have it fail again within an hour against the iron-hard trees. He tried sharpening it differently. He tried a thicker, more robust edge, but it just bounced off the frozen wood, glancing dangerously. He tried a thinner edge, and it chipped almost instantly. He was caught in a trap of his own making, or rather, a trap set by the conventional wisdom of the time. The standard trade axe, mass-produced in the East, was designed for a different world. It was designed for the milder, damper climates of Ohio or Pennsylvania, for felling softer woods. It was not designed for the extreme, dry cold of 8,000 feet, where wood froze solid and steel became as fragile as glass. He wasn't just fighting the cold, he was fighting bad engineering. His frustration turned into a cold, methodical anger. He thought back to the summer, remembering the exhaustion of cutting the green, resinous wood. The axe would sink in, and the soft fibers would grip the blade, refusing to release. It felt like pulling a boot out of thick mud, every single swing. He had to undercut, then overcut, then use wedges just to bring down a single tree. It was a clumsy, brutal, inefficient process. The tool was too thick to slice and too thin to split. It failed in the heat and it failed in the cold. It was, he concluded, a perfectly mediocre tool. He sat by his smoky fire, turning the heavy axe head over in his hands. He felt the balance was wrong. He saw the clumsy, thick profile of the cheeks. He saw the poor quality steel full of impurities. Why, he wondered, did everyone accept this? Why did they accept a tool that fought them at every turn? He had seen other men, settlers and trappers, with the same complaints, but they just accepted it as part of the hardship. They blamed the wood, they blamed the cold, they blamed their own lack of strength. Silas Croft, however, had begun to blame the axe. The turning point came not from a man, but from two. In the spring, after a winter of bitter cold and endless filing, Silas travelled down to the small, muddy settlement in the valley to trade his few remaining pelts. He found a new arrival, a Swedish blacksmith named Magnus Eklund, who had built a proper forge with stone and a massive set of bellows. Eklund was a quiet, broad man, with hands stained black from the forge. Silas brought him his chipped and battered axe head. "Can you fix this?" Silas asked. Magnus took the tool, looked at it, and snorted. "This is not an axe," he said, his English thick. "This is a hammer you sharpen. Poor steel." He tossed it onto a pile of scrap. "I can fix," he said, "but it will still be this, bad, like sharpening a stone." Silas, desperate, asked what he meant. Magnus picked up a piece of charcoal and drew on the anvil base. He drew two different axe profiles. "This," he pointed to a long, thin, tapered shape, "is for cutting, for slicing the tree. The wood is soft, green. You need a thin blade, very sharp, like a knife. It cuts the fibers." Then he drew another shape, a short, thick, triangular wedge. "This," he said, tracing the steep angle, "is for splitting. For hard wood, frozen wood, it does not cut. It breaks. It forces the wood apart." Silas stared at the two drawings. "But how can one axe be both?" Magnus shrugged. "It cannot. This is why in my home we have a felling axe and we have a splitting axe. You use one tool for all things. You have no tool at all." That single conversation illuminated Silas's problem entirely. He had been trying to make a knife do a wedge's job, and a wedge do a knife's job. Later that same week, he met an old Iroquois trapper, known only as Stone Thumb, who was passing through. Silas, his mind buzzing with Magnus's lesson, asked the old man to see his hatchet. It was small, old, and the head was dark with patina, but the edge was immaculate. Silas noted with a new understanding that the edge was not a simple V shape. It was curved like an apple seed, a convex grind. Stone Thumb, through a mix of gestures and sparse words, explained. The curved edge, he signaled, was stronger. It kept more metal behind the cutting edge. It didn't chip, It didn't roll. It might not seem as sharp, but it stayed sharp, and it could be used for splitting frozen wood or even bone without failing. Silas held the hatchet, feeling the balance. He looked at its deceptively tough edge, then thought of Magnus's 2 drawings. He finally understood. He didn't just need a new axe. He needed a new idea. Silas Croft did not have the luxury of carrying 2 separate axe heads, a felling axe and a splitting axe, into the high country. The weight was prohibitive. Every ounce mattered when you were hauling traps, food, and bedding on your back. He needed one tool, but Magnus's words and Stonethmub's hatchet haunted him. One tool for all things is no tool at all. He spent the short, cool nights of that summer sitting by his fire, not sleeping, but thinking. He sketched designs on scraps of cured hide with charcoal. He thought about the problem from every angle. The problem was geometry. The problem was season. Summer wood was soft, wet and fibrous. It needed to be sliced. Winter wood was hard, dry and crystalline. It needed to be fractured. How could one piece of steel do both? He visited Magnus Eklund again. He didn't bring pelts this time. He brought a different kind of currency. He brought a perfect, flawless piece of wagon spring steel he had scavenged from a broken-down freight wagon on the plains. It was high-carbon steel, far superior to the soft iron of the trade axes. "I need a new head," Silas said, placing the steel on the anvil, "but not a normal one." He explained his idea. It was simple, and it was brilliant. "I need a double-bit axe." Magnus raised an eyebrow. Double bits were not unheard of, but they were rare, and most men just used them as a way to carry 2 identical edges, delaying the need to sharpen. "Not 2 same edges," Silas insisted, "2 different edges on one head." He spent the next hour with the charcoal explaining his plan. He would pay Magnus for the forging, and he would do the finishing and profiling himself. It was a gamble. The steel was his most valuable possession, and the forging would cost him weeks of future trapping. But he was no longer just trying to get by. He was trying to solve the problem for good. Magnus, seeing the focused intensity in Silas's eyes, finally nodded. "I can make this. The steel is good. It will sing." Silas spent the next month preparing. He made a new handle, selecting the straightest, most perfect piece of hickory he could find. He cured it by the fire slowly, turning it every night. He carved it with his draw knife, shaping it not for power, but for balance and control. It was perfectly straight, not curved to accommodate the 2 blades. He also prepared his sharpening tools, a new, fine-cut file, and a set of river stones he'd collected over the years, from coarse grit to a smooth black polishing stone. He was not just making an axe, he was creating a system. When he finally returned to the forge, Magnus presented him with the head. It was beautiful, dark, fire-scaled, perfectly balanced, with the eye for the handle punched clean and true. It rang like a bell when he tapped it. His gamble had paid off. The work of finishing the axe was slow, methodical, and almost religious. Silas Croft sat outside his cabin in the late summer sun, the new, dark axe head held firmly in a wooden vise. This was not a quick job of putting an edge on a tool. This was the act of creating 2 separate philosophies in one piece of steel. He began with the summer side. This would be his felling blade. He took his coarsest file and began the long process of removing metal. He worked at a low, acute angle, perhaps 20 degrees. He filed and filed, checking his progress, feeling the bevel with his thumb. He was creating a long, thin, razor-like grind. It took 2 full days of filing just to set the main bevel. He was essentially reshaping the entire profile of that side of the bit, making it thin and sleek, designed to slice deep into green wood. He wanted it to part the wood fibers like a boat's prow parts water, with minimal resistance. After the file, he moved to his stones. He used his coarsest stone to remove the file marks, and then his medium stone, and finally his smooth black polishing stone. He worked with water, creating a slurry that honed the edge to a mirror finish. When he was done, the summer side was terrifyingly sharp. It looked fragile, a glinting, precise instrument. He marked the hickory handle beneath that blade with a simple carved S. Then he turned the axe over. The winter side required a completely different approach. He took his file and worked at a much steeper, more obtuse angle, closer to 30 or even 35 degrees. He was not creating a long, slicing bevel, but a short, stout, powerful one. It was a wedge. This was the edge that would face the iron-hard oak and frozen knots, but he remembered Stone Thumb's hatchet. A simple V edge, even a thick one, could still chip. He took his medium stone and, instead of flattening the bevel, he rounded it. He blended the sharp edge back into the thicker metal of the axe cheek, creating a smooth, convex apple-seed profile. It was an edge that didn't look as sharp as the S side. You couldn't shave with it, but it was backed by an enormous amount of steel. It was designed not to slice, but to withstand impact and fracture the wood apart. He polished this edge as well, knowing a smooth surface would resist rust and slide through the wood with less friction. He carved a W on the handle beneath this bit. When he was finished, he set the head on the perfectly carved handle, driving it home and securing it with a hardwood wedge and a small iron one. He held the tool. It was heavier than his old axe, but the balance was perfect. It felt like an extension of his own arms. His neighbor, Jed, stopped by. He hefted the axe. "That's a mighty strange tool, Silas," Jed said, running a thumb carefully over the S side. "This edge is thin as a knife. It'll break on the first knot." He then turned it, examining the W side. "And this one? Why, it's dull. It's too thick. It won't even bite the wood." Silas just nodded. "Maybe," he said, taking the axe back and sighting down the handle. "We'll see." The first test came in late September. During the rush to build his woodpile before the snows, he faced a stand of tall, green aspen, their wood notoriously stringy and wet. In previous years, this was a day of curses and exhaustion, his old axe sticking with every swing. Silas gripped the handle, his fingers finding the familiar carved S. He took a steady, easy swing at the base of the first tree. The sound was not a thud. It was a sharp, resonant thwack. The axe head sank 6 inches deep into the white wood, but it didn't stick. The thin, polished cheeks of the blade had sliced the fibers so cleanly, and the profile was so lean that the wood itself seemed to spring open to release it. A massive chip, long as his forearm, flew from the cut. Silas swung again. Thwack! Another huge chip. He fell into a rhythm, the axe becoming a pendulum. He wasn't fighting the tool. He wasn't wresting it from the wood. He was simply swinging, and the axe was doing the work. He felled 3 trees in the time it used to take for one. He was breathing easily, his arms fresh. He paused to look at the edge. It was still perfect, a mirror glinting in the autumn light. No rolls, no dings. It was the summer side, and it had passed its test. But the true trial, the one that had broken his old axe and his spirit, was still to come. Winter arrived like a hammer blow in mid-November. The temperature plummeted to 20 below zero and stayed there. The wind howled and the snow piled deep. The world became brittle. Silas needed to split his seasoned oak rounds, now frozen so hard they rang like steel when struck. This was the wood that had shattered his old trade axe. He carried his new tool to the splitting block, the W carved into the handle facing up. He stood a large, knotty round on the block. He took a deep breath, recalling the jarring, painful clang of his old axe. He raised the double bit high and brought it down. The sound was a sharp, clean crack. It was not the sound of steel chipping or wood resisting. It was the sound of a clean fracture. The axe head, driven by the convex winter edge, had acted as a perfect wedge. It didn't try to cut the frozen fibers. It blasted them apart. The round fell into two perfect halves. The blade itself was completely unharmed. He spent the next hour working, and it felt like a revelation. Crack, crack, crack. He was splitting wood twice as fast as he ever had, with half the effort and none of the fear of breaking his tool. The secret was working. The validation of his design was profound, but its true power was revealed in its sharing. That winter was one of the cruelest in memory. By January, other settlers and trappers were in dire straits. Their own all-purpose axes were failing, just as Silas's had. Handles were broken from glancing blows off the iron-hard wood. Heads were chipped and useless. Men were reduced to burning green, sappy pine, which filled their cabins with smoke and provided little heat. One evening his neighbor Jed appeared at his door, his face grim and his hands wrapped in rags. "Silas," he said, his voice low, "my axe head. It's broke, clean in two, hit a piece of oak and it just shattered. I can't cut. I'm burning my furniture." Silas looked at the man's desperate eyes, then at his own healthy, neatly stacked woodpile. He said nothing. He simply went to his shed, retrieved his double-bit axe and handed it to Jed. "WW, side up. Use this, but don't swing it like your old one. Don't try to cut. Just let the weight do the work. Aim for the center." Jed looked at the thick, dull, convex edge with skepticism, but he was too desperate to argue. He took the axe. A few minutes later, Silas heard it from across the clearing. Crack, crack, crack. A steady, powerful, and efficient rhythm. Jed returned an hour later, his arms loaded with split oak, his face a mask of awe and disbelief. I don't understand," Jed said, running a mittened hand over the W bit. "It's not even sharp, but it just works." Silas Croft, sitting by his warm, smoke-free fire, finally explained. He didn't guard his knowledge. He retrieved the piece of charcoal and sketched on his cabin floor. He drew the S side, the acute angle slicer for soft summer wood, and he drew the W side, the obtuse angle convex ice bit for fracturing frozen winter wood. He explained that the secret wasn't magic, it was geometry. It was about matching the tool to the task. Jed listened, his eyes wide. The next spring, Jed was at Magnus Eklund's forge, commissioning his own Croft axe. The idea spread like wildfire. Trappers who passed through learned the secret. New settlers were told, "Go see Croft before you try and cut wood here. Your axe is wrong." Within 5 years, the all-purpose trade axe had all but vanished from that valley. The new standard, the tool that meant the difference between warmth and desperation, was the two-grind double-bit axe. It was no longer one man's secret. It had become the shared wisdom of the high country. Silas Croft, with no formal education in metallurgy or physics, had intuitively mastered principles that engineers would debate for centuries. His secret tool was a perfect case study in applied science, born from necessity. The Summerside was a masterpiece of slicing dynamics. Its long, thin 20-degree bevel acted as an inclined plane. It didn't just chop, it severed the long, flexible fibers of green wood with minimal friction. The polished surface reduced the binding and stick that plagued the crude, thick trade axes. It maximized his energy by turning every pound of force into cutting depth. The Winter Side was a different kind of genius. It was a lesson in fracture mechanics. By using a steep 30 or 35-degree angle, he was already creating a wedge. But by convexing that edge, the apple seed profile he'd learned from Stone Thumb, he had created a design of incredible strength. The convex grind kept more metal directly behind the cutting edge, which distributed the immense localized shock of striking frozen wood. It prevented the edge from chipping or rolling, acting as a shock absorber of sorts. This edge didn't need to be razor sharp, because its job wasn't to cut fibers. Its job was to create a stress riser, forcing a crack to propagate through the brittle, frozen material. He had, in essence, created a felling axe and a splitting maul on a single handle. The better steel from Magnus Eklund was the foundation. It had the hardness to hold the S-edge and the toughness to endure the W impacts. But the geometry was the revelation. He had stopped thinking of sharpening as a single task. He had redefined it as profiling for a purpose. This was a leap in thinking that separated simple survival from true mastery. Today, modern woodsmen, bushcrafters and engineers still use these exact principles. They debate the merits of a Scandinavian grind, a strong wedge, like Silas's winter bit, versus a flat grind, a sharp slicer like his summer bit. Silas Croft had simply looked at the two dominant theories, recognized the value in both, and had the brilliance to put them on the same tool. Silas Croft lived out his days in that high valley. He was never a man of wealth or high station. He was known simply as a man who was always prepared. His cabin was always warm, his woodpile always full. He was the quiet neighbor who seemed to get twice the work done with half the effort, his movements economical and his tools always in perfect order. The axe he had forged with Magnus Eklund outlived him by decades, passed down from Jed to his son and then to his grandson. It became a kind of icon in the settlement, a physical reminder of the man who had taught them to think about their tools. The original Croft axe eventually hung over the hearth in the valley's first meeting hall, not as a weapon, but as a lesson in engineering. The lesson was simple but profound. The wilderness does not forgive compromise. It does not care about the way it's always been done. It demands adaptation. Silas Croft's true innovation was not in the steel, but in his mind. He was willing to observe, to listen, and to reject a tool that failed him, even when everyone else accepted it as fate. He understood that survival was not about brute force, but about applied intelligence. He learned that the greatest tool is not the one you buy, but the one you understand so well that you can remake it to fit the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. He had faced a problem, and instead of just enduring it, he had solved it. His secret was a reminder, etched in steel, that true mastery is found in the humble, critical, and creative act of matching your design to reality.